Taking to the sky inherently means taking risk. Stuff happens, and we want to catch this stuff where it matters least, which is why every type of pilot should be doing a pre-flight inspection. The pre-flight rule to live by here is that if you expect it to fly, inspect it to fly. In this video, I'm gonna walk through my process of making sure that both I and my equipment are airworthy. While this video probably clocks in right around 12 minutes, in reality, this process shouldn't take you much more than 5. Hit that like button if you're ready to jump in, subscribe if you wanna see more of this type of content, and without further ado, let's get after it. So in reality, our checklist should begin before we even consider heading out to our landing zone. And it begins with you, the pilot in command. This is arguably the hardest thing to check due to bias. Obviously we want to fly, and we want to fly all the time, but this is the most important thing to scrutinize as you are the biggest safety factor in any flight. There is a nifty little acronym that can be found in the Aeronautical Information Manual to determine a pilot's mental and physical fitness to fly. And this is the I'm safe acronym. Flying any aircraft demands sound and oftentimes quick decision making. And this acronym targets the factors that will impair this ability. So the I stands for illness. Is the pilot suffering from any illness or symptom of an illness which might affect them in flight? M stands for medication. Is the pilot currently taking any drugs, either prescription or over the counter? Stress. Is the pilot overly worried about other factors in their life? The psychological pressures of everyday living can be a powerful distraction and consequently affect a pilot's performance. And I actually added a second S in here to fit our paramotor needs, sore muscles. As foot launching is especially demanding of our bodies, if we are not physically up for the challenge, it can drastically affect our decision making, especially during a launch. A is for alcohol. Although legal limits vary by jurisdiction, any consumption in the last 8 to 24 hours can impair your judgment. Fatigue. Has the pilot had sufficient sleep and adequate nutrition? And lastly, emotion. Has the pilot fully recovered from any extremely upsetting events such as the loss of a family member? This one's tricky because part of the reason why we fly is for the therapeutic benefits. But there is certainly a limit. If you just had a big blow up with a spouse, maybe flying is not the best choice at this very moment. So take this list to heart, please. And if you do not pass, do not fly. The other objective half of our pilot checklist is what we are wearing. The footwear you choose may vary on terrain, but if you are newer to the sport or flying somewhere with uneven terrain, I highly recommend a boot with at least some ankle support that is lightweight and also flexible. I personally wear and highly recommend oboes for this reason. But of course, whatever is on your feet, make sure that they are laced up. I highly recommend wearing pants, and any that have additional fabric over the knees are great. The rest is really common sense. If you're flying somewhere cold, make sure you've got plenty of layers. Cold can be a big factor in your reaction time. You want to try to avoid hoods. These can catch air and pull and tug on your jugular. It's just a distraction. It's just good practice to avoid strangulation. I have linked all the gear that I use and recommend in the description below. The wing takes minimal time and effort to check, being such a simple system. But this is the component that is keeping you from falling like a rock. My preferred order of operation is to move from riser to glider, starting where the rubber meets the road at our bridles. All bridles, at least to my knowledge, have a sheathing over the webbing, and we want to make sure that that sheathing is intact both outside as well as inside where contact with the carabiner happens. From here, I'll give a general inspection to my riser's webbing to make sure that I don't see any glossiness that could be an indicator of too much wear and a future break. You'll especially notice any fraying or glossiness over the trimmer range. Then I will come to the mullions where the lines connect, and I'll make sure that they are closed and tight by turning them tighter by hand. You don't want to try to loosen them, as this over time could actually loosen them. I will also check where the lines actually make contact with the mullion to make sure that the nylon sheathing protecting the inner Dyneema Kevlar core is still intact. Now I'll move to my brakes and actually make sure that those brakes are tied in correctly and still secure. It's the knot that most gliders actually come with, but if you adjust it, just be sure that you're tying it back correctly. Once I have checked my mullions, I'll go ahead and do a thorough check on the first foot or two, or the propeller zone, to make sure that we don't have any internal brakes. And then for my final check on the lines, I will hopefully be able to hand kite my glider up so that I can visually see all those lines running to the wing and catch any sheathing fray that could indicate a break in the future. Another great thing about hand kiting, if you're able to do it, is that it gives you the ability to pre-flight the weather. If we have a really hard time hand kiting, it's probably not the wisest decision to try to fly. If this isn't a skill in your repertoire, after this video, check out this video linked right here. Being able to hand kite can make your life so much easier. All right, folks, buckle in. It's time for the most technically difficult and time-consuming part of our checklist, and that is our motor. There are many different ways to do a pre-flight perfectly safely and successfully, and there are many different types of motors out there. So I am attempting to give you the general gist of the pre-flight process and the way that I remember and move through these components as efficiently and effectively as possible. Personally, I like to move from front to back, starting with the harness, ending with the propeller. So kicking it off with our harness here, I'm gonna make sure first that my fabric and the stitching are in good shape. Everything looks good, making sure that all my pockets are zipped up. I'm gonna make sure that my connection points to the frame are double backed with an inch of tail. You can see on this one, I didn't have an inch, so I actually increased the tail on this one. Then I come to my reserve, and I'm going to make sure that the plastic wire that is keeping the reserve pouch closed is tucked inside the sheathing, as well as my reserve handle, and that Velcro is fully protecting that handle, decreasing the odds of any accidental deployment. Then I'm gonna come to my swing arm to make sure it moves okay, making sure that all the bolts and pins are in place. The key ring through the U-bolt pin is in place, going through the U. I'll then go to my frame. I'm going to check for any cracks or breaks in the welds or the tubes themselves, especially important if you have an aluminum frame. For the spars, I'm gonna make sure that they are fully set in their sockets and that the safety pins or nipples are exposed. It is a little bit chilly out here. I'll then come to my hoop and make sure that they are also in their sockets fully, safety pins exposed, making sure that the net connection points are on the front of the hoop, and making sure that there is enough clearance from that propeller, at least 4 inches all the way around. When it comes to the net, the first thing I will check here is tension and uniformity all around. And the way that I do this is I actually try to push my hand past the hoop. See here that my hand actually comes a little bit further back than that. So I'm going to cinch it up at the tie down. Then I'll come to my gas tank and I wanna make sure that it is fastened securely. We do not want our tank hitting the propeller. I'll double check fuel level and make sure that that gas cap is in place and secure, threaded on properly, especially for you Maverick pilots. And at this point, I like to follow the flow of the fuel. So starting with my fuel lines, I'll make sure that they are secured to the tank as well as that breather tube on the other side. You also want to make sure that they are squishable. The harder your lines are, the more crackable they are. And once you have a crack, you've got air and now you have an engine out. Moving to my fuel bulb, I'll make sure it's fastened and functioning, free of any dry rot at these seams right here. At this point, I'll prime the carb and then I'll make sure that there are no air bubbles in that line after I've primed it. And don't forget to do your final check on the fuel line connection point into the carburetor. With our carb, if you've got any torque check paint on those screws, it's a great idea to double check that they aren't backing out. We then want to check the point where our throttle cable secures to our throttle arm, making sure that it moves free and clearly, that that spring is returning that throttle back down to the idle stop. And you want to double check that this is true as soon as you put that motor on your back. You don't want to start it up with that throttle arm engaged. Now we'll move to our airbox and make sure it is fastened tightly to the carburetor. I will almost pick up the entire motor with my hands on that airbox. We want to make sure the second connection point, if you have one, is secure. On the Moster 185, there is a Velcro leash that goes from the airbox to the actual main frame, and you want to make sure that's secure as well. From our carburetor, we're following the fuel air mixture now into the crankcase, and the first thing we're going to come across is our sealed gaskets, making sure that they are in good shape, checking for any oil seepage that could indicate loose bolts. You've got 3 main gaskets to check: the carburetor seal, the cylinder head seal, and the exhaust seal. We also want to make sure that any torque check paint on our crankcase is unbroken, and then checking that our cylinder head bolts have threads showing, checking the torque spec based on your motor manual's maintenance schedule. While I'm at the body of my engine, I'm also going to check the engine mount bolts, making sure that those rubber spacers are flexible with minimal dry rot, and that the torque check paint is unbroken. At this point, I find it natural to go ahead and check my electrical system to make sure that my spark plug boot is in place. And you'll notice that I don't try to pull it off. I just press it back on. Pulling it off and pushing that boot back on over time will wear it out and it won't stay on at all. And then I check to make sure that my kill switch wire is securely fastened to my coil. So now we come to the exhaust silencer portion of our check. We want to make sure that the connection at the crankcase is solid, that our spring or bolt tension is secure. On the Moster 185, it comes with a brass O-ring that is designed to wear over time, and they recommend changing this out every 50 hours. And then finally doing a very careful check over the entire silencer, looking for cracks. I like to use a paper towel as I'm doing here, as that's more likely to snag and I'm going to feel a crack better with that fabric. This takes me to my silencer where I'm gonna check the bolts, rivets, and that the bracket is secured. From here, I go to my reduction system. The Moster 185 here has a belt reduction where I'm going to check belt tension to make sure that I can't twist this belt with my fingers more than 1/4 of an inch. I'm also gonna check the belt's teeth to make sure they're intact and have a hard texture. If the rubber is soft or sticky, that means that your belt is slipping and heating up and approaching the end of its lifespan. I'm also gonna make sure that both of the pulley's teeth are smooth. Any nicks or dings here could shred your belt. If you're flying a rig with a gear drive, make sure that your oil is not leaking and make sure that your stoppers are tight and in place. Which brings us to our propeller, which we're going to first make sure that it is installed oriented correctly to the direction of spin. It sounds pretty dumb, but I am certainly guilty of putting my propeller on backwards and wondering why the hell I have no thrust. Here I am checking the leading and trailing edge of my prop to make sure I don't have any nicks or dings that over time could worsen and lead to my prop disintegrating. And then finally double checking that my prop bolts are secure, tightened in a star pattern. Be cautious not to over tighten these bolts, as doing so can crush your carbon fiber propeller. Again, I know this seems like a lot, but when you hammer down the sequence and the flow, it doesn't take very long. So just take that 5 minutes and gain some peace of mind while you're in the sky. If this helps you in your pre-flight ritual, I hope that you'll consider supporting me over on Patreon. To these guys right here, thank you so much for improving this channel's quality and paying me for what I love to do. Check out the link in this video's description to get your name on this list as well. This is Lifted PPG with the mission of making the sport safer and smarter. My name's Micah Stevens. Don't forget to take that deep breath, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.
Watching. We'll see you next time.
Got some sweet merch coming soon. Stay tuned.